We are back with Matt Finch from MechanicalDolphin.com.
So today, we were fortunate enough, like we said before, to have Matt as a guest speaker over at SCLS. And he did some role-playing with Library Island, which is pretty funny since we live here on an island.
Highly appropriate.
So without giving too much away, tell us what the goal was for this exercise, because it was a lot of fun.
Oh, I'm really pleased to hear you say that. So Library Island is kind of like a role play. It's very simple. It's a simulation of 3 libraries on a small island in the middle of an ocean somewhere. And there's a mixed demographic. There's an indigenous community, settlers, there are people who are conservative, people who are progressive. And basically it's a super simple simulation of running a library service. There are little bits of paper that represent the programs and collections. The community come to the library. They ask for services, the librarians provide, and there's an organisation called the Ministry of Shelves which supervises all this and distributes funding and resources. And basically, no one has more than a couple of bullet points to outline their character, so it's not like some big theatrical role play, it's not like improv. But you just let the system run, people interact, conflicts naturally happen, there are failures of the system, and basically you run into the problems and the mess that you find in real life. And so the purpose of this is really it serves as a strategic planning exercise, but to encourage us not to think about the future the way you might in a traditional vision document. Like, here's where we want to be 5 years from now, the golden horizon, everything's going to work out just the way we want. It's trying to get people to remember that the community rarely does what you want or expect them to, that political life is turbulent, that even technological change is turbulent, and actually it's very hard to anticipate what comes next. If you think about the year 2013, for example, if you think back 5 years, if you knew then what you knew now, what would you do differently? We can control the future. Like, there's only one future coming, and it's dependent on our choices. And instead, the reality is, things happen, whether it's the outcome of an election, whether it's a change in technology, whether it's the global financial crisis. Like, I think a lot of public libraries at the level of a city wouldn't have been able to foresee that people making sort of strange debt products in the financial markets would eventually affect the public finances, and then the choices that were made to solve that problem might then impact on funding for public libraries and what people were willing to pay in tax and those kind of things. So sometimes it's hard to see the knock-ons. So we play these games that are messy and unpredictable to remind us of that fact. And there's an element of empathy, because also when you play this game, you could be a librarian who faces a very disruptive, transient member of the public who's effectively homeless and is showing challenging behaviour. But another example which really interested me was that in Oregon, a librarian who considered herself very unbiased and worked very hard to be sort of equal, providing sort of equity of service to the whole community, she ended up in the role of a very conservative character who was campaigning to get a certain kind of book banned from the public library. And the librarian said no, because actually it was within their code to have these books within the library. But they dismissed her, and even though her desire was sort of debatable, she said that sense of rejection she felt, that her wants and needs were being disregarded, made her wonder about how she was treating people with political views that differed from her own. So you enter this fantasy island, there's lots of conflict, there's lots of politics, and we can start to talk about difficult things that are sometimes a little bit too close to home. Like if we talk about questions of homelessness or whatever, if we speak specifically of our community, that can be difficult. But once you've talked about it in the fantasy scenario, it's possible to take some of those ideas with you and start to plan for the future. So that's it in a nutshell. And although you say, only give away a little bit and keep it a secret, I'm very keen for people to use it. So people are welcome to get in touch. There is a CC license copy with the bare bones of the material. And the aim is that people take it, run with it, change it, transform it. That's also in the spirit of libraries, of course, that we share, and hopefully we share professionally as well as sharing with our community.
And you're right. I mean, because we share a lot of what we do. I mean, I know that, if anybody has listened to this podcast, they know that we share everything we talk about. And it's one of the things that we love that guests can come on and share. So Thank you for sharing, Library Island. It was an amazing thing.
A pleasure. And you were on Library Island as well. So if you tell people, that might give them a bit more perspective on what it's like.
Yes. So we were part of the Ministry of Shelves, and it was really interesting because some big rich guy came and bought us all out and took over and set up, and he was a very conservative person who was very against the indigenous language being used at all. It was actually quite entertaining, although it could be quite frightening as well if that were to happen in real life.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would have sold that if it was real life, but
right.
But it was fun to see the reaction of the other people, and to see how some of the libraries transitioned. One library actually revolted from the cooperative and became a free library and was feeding the homeless.
Right.
They were feeding Danish that they had with our breakfast.
They took the Danish from
They
the
took-
catering table. It was great.
Yeah. And most of the libraries, they went rogue almost from the Ministry of Shelves.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we're going to do this anyway, and we're going to figure out another way to pay for it.
Yeah. Which I think those are the kind of challenges we talk about. So I was doing some co-design work recently with librarians and community members in a public library service in the US. And by including the community in making design choices for the future of a library, they themselves came up with the issue of fundraising. They were looking at a library where the hours were a little shorter. They were now closing on Tuesdays, which they hadn't done historically. And they were trying to come up with ways to get that library reopening on the Tuesday that didn't involve raising tax or going back to the city for a bigger allocation. And so they were suggesting maybe this library needs a fundraising manager. You know, what are the options to seriously generate enough money for an extra day a week? Because, you know, it's not something you can do with a GoFundMe page.
Right.
That's maybe not a scenario we want to consider, because of course it would be better if everything was paid for by the city. But the reality is one has to start to think about these other options. And so the reason we play these games is it becomes this safe space to say, what would you do if?